Hugh believes in the power of possibility and community. Hugh is married to his beautiful wife, Amy, and he is an author of the book Dude to Dad, which is Amazon's #1 best-selling parent book. He is a father to Emerson and Finn, and he's recently released 2 more parenting books. As the founder and curator of ODA, Hugh lives and works at the intersection of possibility and community. Now, ODA's focus is about sparking conversations and collisions that can bring about transformable regional actions. ODA, by the way, is for North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota, or the 3 ODA states. Would you all please join me in welcoming Hugh to our stage?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the welcome and for the opportunity to speak today. In the years I've been coming to Fargo, it's never ceased to amaze me how you welcome visitors. Open doors, welcoming spirit, kind words, and genuine hospitality. You're so much more than that as a community in a region. But for someone who first came as an overnight visitor, later as a guest of friends, and now to visit regularly my parents, it has meant a great deal. And it means a great deal today. For the people of Fargo, it may seem a little quaint. But for me, Fargo is always the big city. Right? I suspect something like you would look at Minneapolis or Chicago. Growing up in Millbank, halfway between Sioux Falls and Fargo, this community and this specific place were magical. To the son of an electrician and a stay-at-home mom, the promise of a overnight at the Holiday Inn in Fargo, combined with a stop by Showbiz Pizza to see Billy Bob and the gang, and maybe a little bit of shopping at West Acres if everything went all right, was the thing that dreams are made of. If you had suggested to me at that point that one day I may be speaking to 700 successful community leaders, dramatic change makers in this community, I'd have laughed an 8-year-old laugh and maybe had a 13th slice of pizza. But we are here, and boy, have we both grown up, right? What can I say about Fargo, Moorhead, West Fargo, Cass and Clay counties that hasn't already been said? Forbes' #1 best city. The #1 best place to be young, highest GDP growth in real terms nationwide, 9.7% over a national average of 1.8%. The local population here is set to grow by 30% over the next 25 years. Cass and Clay County are the top 15% of counties in the country, right? Low unemployment, high per capita income. And if you believe Gallup, if that isn't enough, if you believe Gallup, this is the happiest place on earth. Wait, that's Disney World. But the happiest state in the country. Fargo's grown up. It's accomplished so much. It's addressed so many of its challenges. And it may be a little Midwestern for me to say it, but you've realized your potential, right? You've done it. I hate that word, potential. We'll get there. But you've done it. But where does that exactly leave us? Is this the finish line, the destination? Should we just puff our chests, take our medals, and go home? Is this as good as it gets? What if the community is just getting started? Well, what if there's something so much bigger? What if? Because here in the happiest state in the country, more than 13% of the local community live under the poverty line. That's roughly one of each of you at each table. More than 6,000 children. It's hard to believe. 6,000 children in the local school districts below the poverty line, and there's an achievement gap of 15% between those students and the general population in reading, in math, in so many areas. Not to mention that homelessness, something that seems so against everything we are as people of this region, homelessness has doubled in the last 10 years. And poverty all through that has been largely unaffected by the extraordinary economic prosperity that we've realized. But this isn't news to you, is it? Cher has been talking about this, the United Way have been talking about this for years. Education, income stability and independence, health. we've started to address so many problems, met so many challenges, identified so many needs. Things are really good here, right? But what if? What if we capitalized on today, right now, by focusing on the possibility of something so much bigger? What would it take to do this? What needs might we have? What might have to change? What might the challenges be? I want to share some things that I've observed, both here in Fargo and throughout the region through my work with ODA. ODA is a creative collaborative that seeks to engage, empower, and educate the creative change makers, community builders, change agents of the 3 states of South Dakota, North Dakota, and Minnesota. People like you, frankly. We draw our name from South Dakota, North Dakota, and Minnesota, as Cher mentioned. But it grew from this belief that this place we call home has everything it needs to be successful. Perhaps we just need a deeper sense of genuine collaboration, a renewed sense of creative confidence, to have a catalyst for possibility, the possibility of positive change, the possibility of something bigger. I found out years after starting the organization that ODA actually is a Lakota word that means plenty or enough. I believe that we have enough talent. I believe we have enough creativity. I believe we have enough expertise and resources and people. We have enough. I think collectively we have so much going for us. Such a deep sense of work ethic, a commitment to community, a long-term perspective on faith and family and the future. But I believe we also have a system and series of barriers working against us, what I like to call areas of cultural inertia that keep us from being and building and fostering the type of people, organizations, communities that I believe we can be. In some of my favorite writings, the letter from the Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King talks about the societal ills of poverty and racism, prejudice and apathy being combated by a new set of action antidotes to enact change. Something bigger than mere problem solving, something I like to call possibility thinking. This kind of possibility thinking leads to exciting change, transformational change, the kind of change that the United Way of Cast Clay is talking about and has been talking about all along. And I think we can learn a great deal from this framework. So I want to explore, if you'll allow, a couple areas of cultural inertia that I see and the possibility thinking that I believe can combat it, can address it, can engage it. There are so many things to love about this region. I love that people value family and long-term relationships. In South Dakota, we have a little joke that it's 7 degrees of separation everywhere else, but in South Dakota, it's only 1. I suspect that would work here in Fargo as well. In my hometown, everyone knew the mistakes, big or small, that I had made as a kid. But they also knew the mistakes that my grandfather and probably great-grandfather had made, right? This collective knowledge is critical, but it's also limiting. Because in a culture that deeply values connection, overvalues connection, it is much, much harder to evaluate and elevate the value of collisions. Now, this is about to get a little geeky, I warn you all, so just hold tight with me, we'll get there. I spent a good deal of my early education, my early career focused on civic engagement and social capital that results. There are 2 basic concepts of social capital, bonds and bridges. Now, I often think of these as collisions and connections and talk about them as such. Bonded capital is the efficient use of knowledge, skill, information, relationship, resources. This is what we know very well in communities in the Midwest. Bridge capital, on the other hand, is the introduction of new information, new experiences, new ideas, new people, something we're not as good about. In nature, we see the perfect balance of these in a spring-fed pond, right? The idea that it's there to support and nurture the animals, the plants that exist, but also new water to bring it in so it doesn't become stale or stagnant. In human social networks, it's a little bit trickier because we need to deal with the messiness, the pettiness, the unpredictability of human nature. And the effects, however, are the same. Think about any committee you've worked on, right? Especially those that worked well. If you had a shared sense of purpose, clear leadership, defined division of labor, it was probably very efficient. And the more you worked together with those visions, the more clear and efficient things became. Now that's bonded capital, and it's glorious. So what's the problem? The problem is that it's limited. The ideas and influence, the people are limited to the people that are at the table, the minds that are at the table. In bonded social capital, it's only a matter of time before those ideas and relationships grow stale. And more than that, it's extraordinarily challenging to add new people to the mix. Even harder for a new person, a new member of the community, a new immigrant, to add themselves to the mix. Add in barriers of culture, language, experience, expertise, nationality, and it becomes virtually impossible. This region, this community, with its emphasis on connection, makes it very, very hard to collide, hard to build bridges, hard to bring in new information. It comes from an honest place of independence, self-reliance, resiliency, but I believe it's holding us back. It's holding back a more inclusive and engaged conversation and community. This is where the work of the United Way on initiatives like United for Jefferson or Education That Works are truly, truly remarkable. They're bringing diverse, cross-sector, cross-community voices to the same table. The bonded social capital of economic development, or the chamber, meeting and colliding and creating new experiences with those at the schools and nonprofits. These new bits of knowledge and experience coming together to create new opportunities for the community students and the region's students. These unusual, unexpected, mind you, partnerships are the kind of possibility thinking that the United Way does and proves that the United Way does things differently. And I believe the results are going to be dramatic. They'll be dramatic for the community, and they'll be dramatic for the people. This inertia around connection works hand in hand with cultural inertia around networking. If we overvalue connection and undervalue collision, we also diminish those activities that involve and engage and inspire collision. So for many of you I know, networking, right? It's an excuse to get rid of those extra business cards, right? It's a way of justifying that you're doing some business development, or maybe just an excuse to have a really solid, stiff adult beverage, right? It's a social thing. It's a luxury. It's frivolous, and I entirely agree with that perspective. But if we think about how we're doing it, if we're intentional about this effort, even strategic, network building can be transformative. I would go so far as to say, and I tell clients and college students alike this almost every day, I would say that an awareness of network theory, social engagement strategy, and social networks is the single most important skill for the future of business, nonprofits, and the work of organizations like the United Way. It's the theory we've built OTA upon, and I believe it's essential for the future of your work here in Fargo. So let's look at some basic social network theory. We've covered bonds and bridges. The next step is to look at the broader networks that grow out of these systems: centralized, decentralized, distributed. Centralized networks are what we call hub and spoke, right? These networks work through a central point. All relationships pass through that point. They are efficient, but they are extremely vulnerable and entirely dependent on one individual or one organization. If that central individual or organization disappears, dies, or decides that community and communication no longer matter, there's little that can be done. Centralized networks facilitate great things, but have clear limits. Now, decentralized networks are really just layers upon layers of centralized networks. They still thrive on authority. They're a little better because they're more local, but they're still pretty vulnerable, still pretty efficient. How many of our communities work this way, right? One organization that serves as gatekeeper, relationship manager, an individual that we ask to serve on every committee, board, fundraising effort. One small group that has the power to decide whether you're in or you're out, connected or isolated. One critical connection by which the future of the community is built upon. You know the names, right? I've come to know them over the past couple of years. Hugh, have you met X? If you're going to build an organization in this community, you need to know X. Nothing gets done here without X's involvement. Now, X is a blessing from the heavens, no doubt, right? But what about when X is gone, moves, relocates, shuts its doors if it's an organization? I think about these in terms of the gatekeepers online as well. Social media platforms like Facebook. Imagine that tomorrow Facebook disappears. Now, hold the applause back. Hold the applause back. I know you're thinking I'd have more time and maybe less farm bill in my life. But the reality is, how many of your friends would you still have connection to? How many of them do you even have emails or phone numbers for? How would you reach them if that gatekeeper, that central node, disappeared? That's why the future of networks and network building, whether in business, philanthropy, the United Way, is in distributed networks. These networks and those that build them recognize that hub and spokes provide power, but they do not empower community. Let me say that again. They provide power, central and strong, but they do not empower community. These networks thrive on redundancy and bridge relationships. They provide multiple paths for knowledge, relationship, and leadership to flow. They are hard to build and expensive. Apparently $5.5 million expensive. But once they are built, they can withstand virtually anything. These layerless, hierarchy-less systems are where your United Way is working. It would be easy, and it's a pretty common model, for the United Way to make sure that they are maintaining their place in the center. Instead, they're creating relationships where they never were. They're living at the intersection of public, private, nonprofit, and philanthropic. They are a convener and a catalyst for possibility. They are not only bridging gaps between existing networks, like these tables, but they're also bringing individuals to the conversation who never had a connection to the broader community. The impacts of this type of work is dramatic. Leveraging the impact is the work of the United Way. Sociologists have found on average that a human being is part of a personal social network of 120 to 150 people. Not only that, but our research shows that impacts on everything from innovation and creativity to health and weight is impacted not only by our friends and our friends' friends, but our friends' friends' friends. By making just one connection, you can do the math where it previously did not exist. We have the opportunity to impact through one person, 1.7 million people. Now, even in a region like this where relationships are redundant and people know people, perhaps we only reach 100,000 people, but we reach them 17 times. Right? What an incredible thing to consider. What a powerful reality to leverage for good and for community. Certainly something that we don't want to overlook. The next area of cultural inertia, consumption of culture. A while back, I had a truly transformational conversation with a filmmaker from this region that forever changed my perspective about this idea. He shared the following wisdom. When stories we consume are stories of somewhere else, we believe that life happens somewhere else. Now think about that carefully. Think about every song, every movie, every national news story, every cultural trend and meme. When stories happen somewhere else, we think life happens somewhere else. And when the stories are about us, well, I mean, that's usually worse, right? To the south, that's Dances with Wolves, and up here, it's, well, Fargo, right? We've fed the world through the fruits of our labor and the fruits of the land for generations. Yet when it comes to culture, stories about ourselves, well, that's something we don't do. So with ODA, we decided early that the only option was to start to create stories of innovation, stories of risk, stories of success and failure, stories of boldness. We'll get to that in a second. First, we need to address where this resistance comes from, this resistance to story creation and celebration. Dear, dear Axel Sandemos. Now, Axel, how many people know Axel? All right. This is a good crowd. Turn of the century, the last century, Danish author who codified in a book about a fictional Scandinavian village an idea called the Jante laws. These 10 laws, the Jante laws, were referred to in the novel and can be best summarized by, don't think you're anyone special, you're no better than us. Now, Axel didn't create this idea. It was previously and more regularly referred to as the idea of tall poppy syndrome. The idea of tall poppy extends way back to Aristotle in ancient Greece, but the outcomes in this region, they're special. I believe this is what we call Minnesota nice right across the border, and when I speak about it in terms of ODA, I call it forced humility. Now, don't get me wrong. Humility in its pure form is a beautiful and powerful thing. I encourage it. Humility, however, when it is forced, breeds resentment, tension, discontent. It represses creativity, innovation, diversity, and personal identity. The only way that we can counteract tall poppy syndrome and old man Sandemos is boldness. Now, I was a strange child. Milbank is a small town. But when I grew up, I developed a special form of obsession for President Kennedy. Despite noteworthy speeches about passing torches and ask-nots, I found a special speech early on that defined this idea of boldness for me. In 1962, Kennedy did something that modern politicians and community leaders rarely do. He talked about how hard the possibility is. He explained how expensive it would be, how difficult it would be to accomplish the goal. My favorite part of the speech reads like this. But if I were to say, my fellow citizens, that we shall send to the moon 240,000 miles away from the control station in Houston, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, capable of standing heat and stresses several times more than have ever been experienced, fitted together with a precision better than the finest watch, carrying all of the equipment necessary for propulsion, guidance, control, communications, food, and survival on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body and then return it safely to Earth, re-entering the atmosphere at speeds of 25,000 miles per hour, causing heat about half the temperature of the sun, and do all this, and do it right, and do it first before the end of this decade, then we must be bold. Then we must be bold. The understatement of the century, right? Sending a man to the moon, untried surfaces, unknown alloys, though perhaps not that much more bold than the goals of the United Way. Slowing poverty, closing an achievement gap, all of the other incredible efforts to address health and income, then we must be bold. So what does boldness look like? What does creating stories of boldness look like? Working with a film crew called Passenger, we determined to find out. It looks like the eccentric artist creating work for the entire world from the Minnesota River Valley. It looks like a Sioux Falls community builder dreaming about the neighborhood she wants to live in. It looks like my new friend, Steve Zwinger, an incredible man from this region with a story to tell about love and loss, a story of resilience found in the seeds, but in human beings. All of these people have deep, beautiful stories of boldness, and I know you do too, so many more. I often think about what this place looked like 150, 200 years ago. Oral traditions of those already here and letters home from those that followed describe the prairie as a vast sea of grass. You see, that prairie grass, the tall blue stem, was known to grow as tall as 10 feet tall. And when the wind blew, and you know it always does, when the wind blew, it would cause waves across those beautiful shimmering plains. It was said that even on horseback, it was easy to get lost. There was a special grass. Its blade, excellent forage for horses and cattle. Its network of scaly, stout wooden underground stems formed a dense, tough mat that created some of the deepest and most fertile topsoil on our planet. This network of underground rhizomes could independently reproduce and create a new plant, which means that this diversity of individual blades, this diverse prairie, was actually one complex, collaborative, codependent organism. Now, somewhere along the line, things started to change. Whether it was for efficiency or productivity or because it was more modern, we plowed that under. We started planting trees and single crops. They were independent, singular, autonomous. They had deep roots, but they had little diversity, little connection to each other. And so it continued for over 100 years to the point where it is now that if my branch extends just the slightest over the fence of my neighbor's, it's a critical offense. So much for one organism. So much for one community. I've seen this in Fargo a little bit over the past couple years as well. It can be subtle or not so subtle, but some barriers, boundaries, and separation have grown where they never were. Perhaps it appears in the young entrepreneurs who think they've invented community or overlooked the work of generations. Perhaps it's in the leadership of the community, and I hear the whispers The leadership of the community that I hear is stuck in a rut or won't pass the torch. Maybe it's in the nonprofits of the community who don't know how to innovate, or the business community that isn't invested in critical community needs. Everyone has a perspective. Everyone sees it slightly differently, but the division is there nonetheless. I've heard it all. I've heard it here, I've heard it throughout the region. But the good news is, I believe in possibility. There are places nearby in the prairie, 100 years later, that are being restored. Native bluestem, native cordgrass are being replanted. There's a movement towards connection, codependence, complexity. Why can't this exist in our community as well? Imagine a place or a system or set of processes where ideas of all sorts, formal and informal, rigid and relaxed, from all sorts of people and perspectives come together with a shared sense of possibility. What would our streets look like if bicycles had the same voice at the table as automobiles? How might architects or artists change their work if farmers and fast food chefs were part of that process? What would our schools look like if politicians and parents, both poverty-stricken and privileged, shared that same table to imagine them? This type of collaboration, diversity, strength, wisdom, shared destiny has a place here on the plains. It always has, really. And especially now, it's a place in our future as well. The United Way is an organization that is making an impact through possibility. They are creating collisions and connections. They're bonding and bridging. They are strategic and intentional about building networks. They are telling stories that matter. And most importantly, perhaps, they're being bold. But they need you, each of you. They need your time. They need your resources, they need your talent, they need your voice, and they need your support. Because what you do next is what really matters. All you've done to this point is great, but I believe this is the beginning. What you do next is what really matters. Your community is watching, the region is watching, I'm watching. Now is the time. It's the time for Fargo to be bold. Can't you just imagine the possibilities? Thank you.